Heads up, this month's book touches on some potentially sensitive subjects, which include the sudden loss of a parent, arson, child abuse, unexpected pregnancy, suicide, and sexual assault. Listener discretion is advised. Hi, I'm Rose.
And I'm Nico.
And this is Robot Elf Book Club. We read and discuss new science fiction and fantasy and etc. books. On this episode, we are discussing Meet Us by the Roaring Sea by Akil Kumarasamy, which was published by Macmillan Imprint, Farrar, Straus, and Giroux. I think that's right. It was released in North America on August 23rd, 2022. We're gonna talk a little bit about what happens in maybe the first 2/3 of this book. We'll take a break and have a quick intermission. And after that, we will discuss the book's conclusion and try to keep any major spoilers to that section. There will be some timestamps in the show notes if you want to skip over anything that's too spoilery. Due to the nature of this book, I sort of feel, Nico, like we can talk exhaustively about the events that take place in the plot without having much of an impact on the reading experience that any of our listeners might have, because the language and the structure of this book, are so much a part of it.
Yeah, I was going to say that, I was going to say that I love this book. But if someone were to come and ask me, like, oh, yeah, what's it about? I'd be like, oh. So it's very much feels like it's like it really seems to me that it's an art, like a capital A art. But that means you can interpret it however you want. And no one can say that you're wrong because it's an art. So I don't typically do very well with art, capital A art. But I still really enjoyed this book. So this whole podcast is going to be you and I going like, so what happened in this book? Well, I think this is what happened. No, this is what, I don't know what happened. Maybe this is what happened.
Yeah, exactly. I think people talk a lot about puzzle box books. I happen to really like a puzzle box book. I don't think that this one falls into that category. It's sort of... it's a book that reflects back to you what you bring to it.
Well, one thing I really enjoy about Life of Pi is I've referred to Life of Pi as ambiguity done correctly. Because if someone reads the end of Life of Pi and they're like devoutly religious, they're like, see, this shows that God exists. And then if someone who is absolutely like atheist reads it, they're like, see, this shows that God does not exist. And they're both correct. Their interpretations are correct. And so that to me is like whatever you bring into it is like, yeah, that's ambiguity done correctly. And so this book kind of falls into that same kind of category of whatever you want to read into it. That's why it's a capital A art.
Right. Yes, exactly. I very much agreed. I want to, for the benefit of our listeners, I wanted to read a plot synopsis, and I tried to put a link here.
I've got the Goodreads synopsis up if you want.
Oh, you do? Yeah. Could you please read the Goodreads synopsis for us?
All right. In the near future, a young woman finds her mother's body starfished on the kitchen floor in Queens and sets on a journey through language, archives, artificial intelligence, and TV for a way back into herself. She begins to translate an old manuscript about a group of female medical students living through a drought and at the edge of war as they create a new way of existence to help the people around them. In the process, the translator's life and the manuscript begin to become entangled. Along the way, the arrival of a childhood friend, a stranger, and an unusual AI project will force her to question her own moral compass and sense of goodness. How involved are we in the suffering of others? What does real compassion look like? How do you make a better world?
So that is a description of this book. Would you agree?
Yeah.
I think that hits all of the major points. Yeah, it's about a young woman who's training an AI and also translating a manuscript from Tamil. We found this book in a listicle on Tor.com. It was they do lists of upcoming sci-fi titles, upcoming fantasy titles, and then this one was on the list of upcoming horror slash spec fic slash etc. titles.
I don't know that I
It
would call it horror, honestly.
No. This I think this falls into the category of etc. It is marketed as literary fiction, although it takes place in the near future, and there are technologies that are somewhat advanced. I think this is what I'm going to say. I think that this definitely qualifies as sci-fi because if the discourse on Twitter in recent weeks has taught us anything, it's that if money in your story is referred to as credits, then you're in a science fictional universe.
Doesn't it make
Right.
sense for money to be called credits, though?
It does. It
What is
does.
a dollar, really?
But see, if you were in a fantasy, it would be called coin.
Mm-hmm. True.
That's the dividing line.
Yeah, but if you're
there.
in Star Trek, it's called dilithium or something.
They had credits in Star Trek, or what was it that the Ferengi used?
I'm pretty sure that was like gold-plated dilithium. No, is it dilithium? It's something started with a D.
I have to Google
I'm
this
such
now.
a big nerd. I know it's got to be
Ferengi
something I use now.
money. Latinum.
Latinum.
A highly precious liquid metal.
Dilithium's the engine crystal. That I'm getting my crystals mixed up.
Latinum pieces. If they're Latinum pieces, you're a fantasy race in a sci-fi show. Okay. So we found this book on this list of etc. type books, and I think we both found it really intriguing. I don't remember if it was specifically compared to House of Leaves, but I think we both definitely
I think I specifically compared it to House of Leaves.
Okay, yeah, I think that was the impression.
When I was reading the synopsis of it, I was like, oh, translating a manuscript with possibly creepy results, that feels very House of Leaves. And then because House of Leaves is a book about a manuscript written by a blind man who watched a movie. And so there's this quote from this book. As I was reading, I was like, yes, this is very House of Leaves. The quote from this book is, this is a manuscript that no one will read about a movement that no one really knows. And I was like, okay, so I was correct. This is going to be House of Leavesy. And in a way it was, but also in a way it wasn't.
Yeah, sort of there's this idea that the manuscript sort of bleeds into the narrator's life. And I mean, and that does kind of happen, not to the extent I think that I was expecting. But that's okay. I'm very okay with it.
I felt like this book did have some like brainworm qualities.
Mm-hmm.
Like there are some parts of the book where it alludes to the manuscript taking her over and infecting her. And I feel like this book was written in a way to make it feel like this book was taking you over and infecting you. And I felt like it was fairly effective, actually.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I mean, it was very explicit about the fact that our main character, was making choices about how to translate the work. There are a lot of echoes of, specific dialogue or concepts that are sort of mirrored, in the events that are happening in her life and in the things that are happening in the manuscript, and whether that's just coincidence or whether it is, the author sort of mirroring her experiences back into the translation that she's writing. It's ambiguous, right? But I did, when I was making my notes and highlighting in the books, I did highlight a number of these passages where sort of the same phrase was showing up on both sides of the narrative, essentially. So let's talk a little bit about our main character. She's basically unnamed through most of the book. We both noticed people referring to her in reviews as Aya, and I think we were both really puzzled by that. There is a passage in the first couple of pages of the book where it's a quote from her mother, and it's unclear whether the character's name is Aya or whether that's just sort of like an expression. that she's just like, yeah, like,
Yeah, that's kind of how I read it. That's why it just went right over my head. I was just like,
yeah. It went right past me too. But I think for the sake of clarity, so we don't have to keep saying the narrator, the unnamed narrator, let's just agree to call her Aya because
sure.
it's simplest. Even though it escaped us in the first time through. Her mother has recently died unexpectedly, and that phrase comes up a lot. Starfished on the kitchen floor. It really paints a very vivid picture for the reader of how her mother passed. The specific cause of death is not named, whether it was aneurysm or stroke or, heart attack or whatever. It just, she dies at home by herself. And our main character is a young woman. She has a degree in machine learning and language acquisition. She's in her mid-20s. She has a well-paying job training model AIs. This is what she does for money. And she is living in her mother's house. Her mother has inherited this house from her mother, who inherited it from her mother. So it's been in the family for generations. Her mother had been kind of a hoarder. It sounds like she had collected all of these objects, and she would, tell everybody, or tell specifically her daughter, that this, used to belong to, so-and-so, the famous jazz musician or whatever. And sort of, I think everybody, her daughter included, sort of understand that probably a lot of this is bullshit, like made up histories of things that she, has assigned this significance to.
This whole beginning section of the book, talking about her experiencing her mother's death and everything, that really grabbed me because I lost my mother in an accident. I want to say recently, but it was literally a decade ago now, and it feels like it was yesterday. And if anyone has any doubts that this feels accurate, it is absolutely accurate. It felt like this book was basically written by me. And there's this theme of people mentioning the 2-week time period to the main character, Aya, over and over, like 2 weeks. Oh, you've been floating for 2 weeks. Oh, you've been in space for 2 weeks. It took like pretty much exactly 2 weeks for the numbness to wear off. And I was doing so much stuff during that time because I was the executress of the estate. So I was settling all her accounts and closing out her credit cards and doing all these different things. I have almost no memory of those 2 weeks. I was literally floating during that time. And the descriptions in this book, and again, the prose is really beautiful. The descriptions in this book just felt so true to me that I don't know anything about this author, but it would not surprise me to find out that she has experienced this herself. And also my mother was a bit of a hoarder as well. So the descriptions of going through the house and having to sort through all these things that mean nothing to you, but might have had some meaning to them, and you don't know what they are, and also just piles of junk that nobody needs. It was just like, yeah, this is real. This is so real.
Yeah, it really hit home for me as well. My dad passed unexpectedly, and I was too young to have to be the person who was, coping with the aftermath of that. But that feeling of unrealness that you have immediately in the wake of losing someone close to you unexpectedly like that, I thought was conveyed really well. And, also sort of being surrounded by the possessions, of this person who's no longer in your life. I mean, like my dad had been a radio DJ, and that was really important to him. And he had this immense collection of old vinyl records. And I do really remember going through that stuff and, just having this weird feeling, this weird sentimental attachment, to these things, even though, they didn't have any particular meaning for me, just sort of their presence had a role in my life that was sort of unexpected until I was really faced with that. It cut a little close to home for both of us, I think. And she talks about, the house being full of all of this stuff, providing structure, to her life. But with her mother gone, sort of the structure left. Right. And in the house with her is her younger cousin, Rosalind, who is an interesting person. She is, despite her young age, she's an associate researcher in a pharmaceutical lab that's developing experimental treatments for Alzheimer's. And in her free time, she enjoys binge watching episodes of this reality TV show called Soldiers' Diaries, which follows, American soldiers in quote unquote stabilization zones. These places are not specifically, named. We can imagine where they might be. And the episodes are aired, I think, 3 years after they're filmed, for out of like privacy concerns. They don't want to disclose tactical information or whatever. But like these soldiers are, they're TV stars. And some of the stuff that's on this TV show is pretty awful, it sounds like.
It's the worst kind of reality TV.
the worst kind of reality TV. Yeah. The bubbly young lady who, says, well, if there aren't any marks left, there no violence has been done. Right. Ooh, that's yikes. So these two young women are living in the house together. They're leaving the mother's stuff undisturbed. So there's sense that it's kind of like preserved in amber, out of respect for her. And in the immediate wake of her mother's death, the Aya sort of goes into a fugue state. She wanders. They say it's like her space, her wandering in space or something. She's sleeping on park benches. That's a thing that's not very realistic because we all know that park benches have, arm rests in the middle of them, so you can't sleep on them anymore. Mm-hmm. But yeah, she's a little bit of a vagrant for a couple of weeks, but she gets it back together and returns to her job, her well-paid, office job where she's training AIs. And she's writing an English translation of this Tamil manuscript that, did we talk about that very much?
Not yet,
she studied the language when she was in college, just was really interested in this manuscript. The manuscript is written from the point of view of a bunch of female medical students during the 1990s. The specific location where they're at is not named, but from the description of what's going on, you can sort of conclude that it's taking place at the southern tip of India, and going on at the same time as the civil war in Sri Lanka. Because there are refugees coming. There's a drought going on. Everybody's eating, rations of rice and boiled peanuts. They're all starving and miserable. And these gals are learning to become doctors. And the manuscript is written in the first person plural, which is very, very interesting and unusual. There's no specific narrator. Some of the students are mentioned by name, but there's never a part of it that seems to be written from one particular person's point of view or another. It's just we did this and we experienced this and we saw this.
I actually found the points of view in this writing actually were really interesting because the whole book is written, well, not the whole book, the main parts of the book are written in second person. So everything is, you are doing this, your mother did this, you, which is odd and not a common point of view choice. But like we were saying before, it has that kind of brainworm quality where it's like, oh, it is me. I am doing this. And it's like kind of takes you over. But then when you switch into the manuscript, it has that collective we. Mm-hmm. Yeah. So it's an interesting use of point of view. And as this podcast goes on, we're almost certainly going to run into a first person present tense, and I will rant incessantly about it. So points of view are something I get really worked up about. But these ones I felt were used very effectively. So I thought it was interesting.
Yeah. I have some of these events, I think, probably out of order. So I'm just going to kind of go through this as I wrote them down. Aya, our narrator, is in touch by video chat with her former language professor, Socrates. He's living in, I think she says, Germany. He's helping to take care of his daughter's newborn infant because his son-in-law has run off and abandoned the family. So he's having to be a new father again at age 60 plus. So all of his chats with her, he's like burping the baby or like getting bottle ready or something. There were a lot of babies in this book, I noticed.
There's like a theme of motherhood throughout the whole thing. Yeah. And so that kind of brings me to a question. Maybe this isn't the best spot for it, but you as a programmer, if you program an AI, would you consider yourself to be its mother?
I don't think that I've ever felt that kind of personal connection with the program that I've worked on. I mean, sometimes after a big project, you sort of say, oh, well, I feel like I just had a baby, because it was like this major undertaking. It was very difficult. But I, certainly have never felt that personal connection with code or with a database or anything like that. No.
There is a bit of a theme of creation as well. And it's one of the snips that I pulled out was the snip where you're creating a card. And shit, where is it? Maybe I didn't save it after all. But she was talking about how she created a card for her mother in the act of creation. And she wondered if that's how her mother felt when she held her for the first time. And it's like, okay, so this is like motherhood equals creation. And then you have the people programming AI, which equals creation. And then there's like a whole lot of themes in here that I couldn't really put my finger on. Like every time I tried to grab them, it like squirted right out of my hand. So there's like so many things in here you could write essays on in high school, basically.
Yeah, exactly. I felt very much like a raccoon with a piece of cotton candy, washing it in a river. Like, where did it go? Where did it go? Like, I felt like that so much reading this book. Like, it just, I would feel like I had it in my hands and then it was just gone. The card in question, the little card that she programs as a child in elementary school, it does specifically include like an image of spiders like crawling around a heart made out of spider eggs or something like that, which I also found quite funny. And another thing about this,
I found the snip if we want to include it.
Oh, sure, yeah, read it.
It's strange that you can't remember your mother's reaction to the card, only the act of creation, the dampness of your hands, the breathless feel in the hollow of your throat, a brief space of suspension. You sometimes wonder if that's how your mother felt when she held you for the very first time. I probably should have snipped more of it, but that's the only part I kept in my notes.
That's fine. Yeah, that's good. That's good. It was a good catch. I think that she talks about that feeling later in the book too. That fluttering feeling right next to your collarbone. So I want to bring up a part of the book that I know really puzzled you, which is about Sal. Sal, the artist. Let's see here. That's a childhood friend of Aya's. She returns to town unexpectedly after her parents, Mr. and Mrs. Ahmed, are killed in an accident between two self-driving automobiles. And here is a passage from the book about that. The manufacturer, Solentel, said the cars exchanged data and attempted to make the best decision. Medical histories and demographic information were included. Pakistani, Muslim, heart condition, diabetic, Caucasian, Christian, baby eczema, and so on. The company involuntarily confessed to these details through a leak. In the past year, there have been a number of accidents with similar results, and the CEO of Solentel responded that race, age, wealth, and religion had in no way impacted the decision-making process of the cars. These were tragedies, simple as that. Sal, the bereft daughter, is an artist, and she ends up turning her parents' home into an art installation. She sort of disassembles it and puts a lot of the furniture out in the back, I think. And Aya and Rosalind spend some time over there hanging out, and it's trying to act like it's just normal that all the furniture is out back. And I think that there's a contrast to be made between the way Sal sort of contends with the sudden death of her parents in the way Aya does. And I feel like in the end, sort of they come to sort of some closure. Like maybe they both sort of learn from each other. I don't have anything strong to point to.
Well, that's how this entire book goes, like that. I don't have anything strong to point to. I just felt like this is how it went. That's basically this book in a nutshell.
Yeah. But obviously, I mean, here's some artificial intelligence played a role in the death of her parents, and it's sad. It's really...
That's basically the trolley problem. I think the book even mentions the trolley problem as it's describing it, right? So it made these calculations like, oh, this is a mother and a young child. They're much younger than these two other people, and these other people have health problems. So if we have to kill one of them, it's going to be that one.
It's going to be the older folks, yeah.
In this future, there are also AIs calculating how much carbon you use. So if you use too many carbon things, like if you have a big steak, that's very expensive in terms of carbon score. You start getting charged extra for it, which, honestly, sounds like a decent solution to the carbon problem, even though it's very uncomfortable for society as a whole. But I could see how that's not going to be well received by everyone because it's going to be uncomfortable. And there's also, what was I going to say? Oh, there's lots of themes of data collection and lack of privacy in this future that they're in as well. And so there's just a theme of AI just kind of being everywhere. And one thing that Aya mentions when she's at work at one point, there's a snip from the book that says, "Back at your desk alone, you repeat, 'We are not bad people.' And Bogey waits, full of potential to be anything." So the AI that she's programming is called Bogey, or Bogey. I assume it's pronounced Bogey. I think that's how the UK pronounces Bogeyman, but it could be Boogeyman. Because we're in North America where we say boogeyman instead of boogeyman, and we have boogers and not bogies. But in this snip, she's kind of saying, like, this AI that I'm programming could be anything, but it's probably going to get used to do something uncomfortable and annoying for everyone, like scanning your carbon score, or scanning your iris to see how much money you have left, or serving ads to you or something. I'm creating this thing,
collecting data in a way that is used against you.
I'm creating this thing, and it's going to do something that I possibly don't agree with, but I have no control over it after I've created it, which is very similar to when you give birth to a child. If it goes on to become a mass murderer, what do, right? You created this thing and it went on to do something. So the authors of software that can be used for shitty surveillance often do not intend for their software to be for the uses that their software is eventually put to. Just like the people who kept lists of their customers who were keeping kosher or whatever did not intend for the Nazis to come and seize those and use them to hunt down Jews, right? So I just thought that was an interesting snippet in this book full of interesting snippets.
Yeah, I think she does accidentally call it booger at first. She does mention that. The name was suggested to her by her coworker, Ricky, who is somebody she goes out to dinner with a few times. It seems like she's maybe a little bit sweet on him. I think another one of her coworkers seems to notice that, and she, her other coworker is like looking at this guy's desk and seeing he doesn't have any pictures or any plants or anything like that. She's like, this guy is not going to stick around. Basically, and she is right, as it turns out. And Ricky has this fantastic line, which I put here in my notes. He says, "The real difference between machine error and human error is that no one gets in trouble when AI makes a mistake," which is something that I talked about during our last podcast. I think the idea that if a machine makes a particular decision, no person can be held accountable for that.
Isn't that convenient?
Isn't that convenient? And yeah, it's one of those ways that data ends up being used against us. Ricky, I don't know if we really get a terribly good picture of him in the book. He eats garbage. He fills his body full of garbage.
He eats a lot too.
He eats a lot. and the Aya in particular is sort of agog, at him eating like a double cheeseburger, and he's running up his carbon score and whatever, and he ends up confessing to her that he's got this growth on his back. So maybe he has got some kind of health condition. And so even though he's, eating and eating and eating, he's still gaunt.
Yeah, I wasn't clear if that was cancer, because I believe it was described as he put her hand on his back and her fingers sank in like there was a hole there.
Oh,
so it
yeah,
wasn't so much like a growth. It was like something he was eating away at him inside, which again, that's that theme of eating that I noticed that.
Yeah. That's more poetic, certainly. There's something wrong with him. He's just like all consumption. Yeah, I don't know. But he has these kind of deep insights, like the one I just mentioned. He does disappear. They're just stop showing up for work one day. So yeah. Let's talk about Cheese. Cheese the person, not Cheese the food.
Well, I mean, Cheese the food would also fit under this theme of eating, But.
So cousin Rosalind, the big fan of the TV show Soldier's Diaries, brings a vagrant into their home, into Mother's house. This is the man who is known as Cheese. It turns out to be a former star of Soldier's Diaries. He seems unwell. He seems like he's got something wrong with him. Aya does not care to have this strange, smelly man sleeping on her couch. She doesn't understand why her cousin insists on having him there. But it turns out that it's not just Rosalind being a good person, although she, tries to say that in the beginning. She's like, I couldn't just leave him. It's Cheese. Rosalind, as it turns out, is giving him room and board in exchange for testing out her experimental drug on him.
Yeah, I got the impression that Cheese was suffering from some pretty severe PTSD from his time in war, basically.
Yeah.
All of that was televised during the Soldier Diaries show, which is how Rosalind recognized him. And now he is homeless. And he had a dog named Cookie, but he has lost his dog recently. But his memory seems really impaired because of the PTSD and possibly because of some brain injuries or something else that might have happened. Or maybe he's been doing some substance abuse. I don't think we had any indications of him doing drugs while he was with them, but it could have happened.
Nothing specific.
It certainly could have happened in the past because he is dealing with all the trauma of this situation. So Rosalind takes him in, and she's been doing research on Alzheimer's already, trying to unlock memory, like genetic memories, like taking fingernail clippings and hair or whatever else, and unlocking memories with it. So now that he's having memory problems, she's taken him in, and she's going to try to unlock his memories.
Yeah, one of the things Rosalind says about this therapy that she's working on, she says, memory is just stories paired with strong feelings. My confronting their subconscious through continuous low-level exposure to traumatic memories, somewhat analogous to what one does to overcome an allergy, they can change their stories and eventually outgrow their pain. The immune system will no longer go into an inflammatory fight or flight response. And then she talks a little bit about, we just need to take a nail clipping or a piece of hair and extract these molecular memories, or at least the memories that have a strong imprint. And this is very funny because when Sal first comes back to town, I noticed that what Rosalind says to Aya is, isn't that weird girl who used to make collages out of like nail clippings and hair and stuff? And I was like, oh, are we so quick to criticize collecting nail clippings and hair? Yeah, that's one of those details that kind of sails under the radar and definitely has a different resonance the second time through, which is why I really wish
this isn't just a reread book. This is like a read 3 or 4 times and then write a thesis about book.
Yeah, it's got layers to it for sure. Aya has some casual and mildly comical sex. I don't think we need to talk about that too much. It does come up later.
least it wasn't with a spider, you know.
Oh my God, yeah. At least her sex partners only had 2 legs. Presumably, if they had more, she didn't talk about it. So we'll just let that be what it is.
And boy, if someone listens to our podcast out of order, that comment is going to be like, "What the?
What is wrong with you? What's wrong with you, ladies?" So I think that's all the setup. I don't know if there's anything else that we can talk about with the manuscript. There is a point where the medical students they're exploring this concept that Aya translates as radical compassion. They're trying to have the maximum amount of empathy that they can with their patients in order to treat them most effectively. And they split into these different factions that have sort of differing philosophies on how best to achieve that compassion. There's one student who is named after an ancient Tamil poet, and she is saying, we have to listen to the experiences of our ancestors. There's, I think, a different student who thinks that they can best achieve radical compassion through sort of emptying themselves out, hollowing themselves out, so they can best, feel the pain of the people they're treating, the refugees. And it's sort of grim, but one of the benefits they think that they have about being in this position of absorbing all these refugees or these people who are starving during this drought is that there are plenty of people who need healing. It's a little bit dark. I can't remember what the third faction was, but there was a third faction. And I never was able to kind of fit that together with the rest of the manuscript. Or the rest of the book, the rest of the novel. I don't know if you had any particular thoughts about that or not.
No, the whole India storyline from the manuscript was really nebulous to me. Like it follows the medical students. It's like a severe drought and famine during wartime. There were lots of protests. They smashed up a statue of Gandhi or something like that.
I think so. Yeah.
And then I guess the rest is spoilers. But there's also the storyline of the missing fisherman. Did you actually figure out what happened to the missing fisherman? Because I did not understand how that tied into anything at all. There's like 72 missing fishermen.
Yeah, I wasn't able to kind of match that up with anything. I think it's probably also important to mention that in the manuscript, one of the things they mention is like their prime minister is a former movie star, and their PM basically has this social program where she sends televisions out to every household. Every household gets a free television because she thinks that it's like super important for us to be connected to the world, or whatever. And somehow a lot of the students sort of conspire to claim their TVs, claim their free TVs from the government. I mean, this is a thing that people do, right? I mean, we certainly during this time of pandemic collected all the free COVID tests we could get and distributed them through all of our friends and stuff.
Free stuff. Why wouldn't you want a free TV?
Free stuff. But so they all have these TVs in their rooms, but there's only so much electricity. You know what I mean? Like if they all watch their TVs at the same time, like they'd have a brownout basically. So they work out the schedule where everybody gets to watch their TV for like 20 minutes a day. And they really love their TVs. They get to see what's going on around the world, and they feel like so connected. I was going to say this is sort of in contrast to the Soldier's Diaries show that's taking place in Aya's world and in her timeline, because it's just like this passive, crappy, shitty entertainment show that's made from the worst thing in the fucking world, versus, the experience of these medical students in this land that's sort of affected by war and famine. Like they're having this opposite experience where they're getting to sort of enjoy seeing things from elsewhere around the world that are, not necessarily awful and shitty.
Yeah, this might be a good time to talk about the theme of screens that I noticed as well, because
Mm-hmm,
there is
mm-hmm.
this theme of like the AI have screens, the televisions have screens. There's televisions in both timelines. There's this theme of viewing life as if it's a television show, because like reality is just too difficult to process. So you're just gonna see that. And there's a quote I have snipped here that says, "In order to truly awaken, you must break through the screen of this world." So it's like reality is just too horrifying. So in order to distance yourself, you just treat it like it's a show. It's not something that you have to process, because it's just entertainment. Entertainment. Soldier's Diaries is horrifying, but it is technically entertainment and that sort of thing. So another snip from it is, did we hope to find refuge in a glowing box where life was more visceral and complete? So they're escaping reality because reality sucks, basically.
Yeah.
And that is a theme throughout the entire book. But then you think about the AI who have screens, and they are some of the things that are oppressing reality in Aya's timeline. So what does that mean?
Yeah, and one thing I meant to bring up earlier is as how AI and how data is used in Aya's timeline and in her world. One of the things that they talk about is how if you forget your credit card or your computer or whatever, when you go out shopping, they'll just do a retinal scan to get your credit information. But this is like the method that they do, the method that they use to do this is like painful. It's physically painful to have your eyeball scanned so you can pay for your stuff, which I thought was interesting. If it was more painful for us to give up our data, would people do it as much as we do? If it wasn't just, reading, quote unquote, a long EULA and clicking agree to whatever because I want to use this software, I want to use the service or whatever. And you're giving up like all of your location info and your demographics and all kind of ridiculous stuff. So yeah, the painful retinal eye scans, definitely a thing. Gosh, where should we start? Where should we start with like the big stuff?
God, this book just like jumps around so much that I think we can start anywhere we want.
That actually reminds me of another thing I wanted to mention, which is that there are a few places in the book where the author sort of puts you in the moment immediately after something has happened, which is really disorienting. And it makes you go, wait, what? What? Did I miss something? And the answer is no, you didn't miss anything. The thing that just happened hasn't actually been talked about yet.
Yeah. The way it was written is I'm what people call a snowflake writer. So I'll have an idea and I'll just like draw a line in my document and start writing, and it'll be like, this happens and then line, oh, this happens and then line, and then this happens. Yep. It's like, that's basically how this book is written, which gives me hope because you can't publish a book that doesn't have any links between the events.
Yeah, the moment that stands out in my mind is right after Aya has thrown up at work, which is when she finds out that she is pregnant, which is the outcome of the comical casual sex from earlier in the text. Like, oh, she has this a surprise
kind
baby.
of depressing casual sex, to be honest.
Kind of depressing. Another interesting thing about this book is that even though it talks about things that are depressing, and even though it has this theme of grief, I never felt sad while I was reading the book. I finished it feeling very hopeful. And I think there's a very interesting sense of humor that comes through in the text that keeps it from feeling bleak and oppressive.
Honestly,
did you get that sense?
I was considering comparing it to Vonnegut because he tackles some horrible things. And it's just sort of whimsical the entire time. And this isn't exactly whimsical, but it had that same kind of like tongue-in-cheek, like, hey, horrible things are happening, look at that, but also humanity kind of feel to it.
Yeah, I agree. For whatever reason, that made me think of the moment where Aya comes home when she's coming to terms with having cheese in the house. She comes home and she finds logs in the toilet, basically.
Yeah. And I was like, well, at least he used the toilet. He was homeless.
He did use the toilet. So there's that. And she as a way of practicing radical compassion in her own life, she tries to spend as much time as she can in the bathroom with this human shit just to exist with it. She does make it for about 30 seconds. And so I think that I felt like that was the moment beyond which she was able to sort of relate to cheese more as a human being and not as like this weird, smelly intruder in her house. So that did have a benefit for her. Unfortunately for Rosalind's experimental drug treatment, which was intended to sort of act as, what is that kind of therapy called? Is it aversion therapy, where they work with people who have phobias to like gradually expose them? Exposure therapy. It doesn't actually have the outcome she has desired, although Cheese has sort of recovered his memories and seems like he cleans up real well.
Can I just say that Rosalind is a very unethical researcher?
Yes.
Because Aya comes home at one point, because the way this seems to work is Rosalind turns your genes into a jar, a vial of liquid, and you like sniff it. So the fumes unlock your memories or something.
Yes, and you huff memories.
Yeah, basically. And so Aya comes home and she finds Cheese lying on the ground, just like in the middle of what seems to be a panic attack, or like he's remembering something that's not good. It's something to do with the war, and he's just not having a good time. And he's just there alone. Rosalind is not observing this at all. She's not monitoring. She's not making sure he's safe. She's not making sure he has like debriefing ability afterward or anything like that. Like this is just, I was just like, oh my God, this is so unethical.
She leaves him at home with sun butter and toast, basically, and he's got to take care of himself. It's kind of on the positive side, perhaps for Cheese, like he recovers the memory of his baby brother, which was a little icky to read about because it kind of sounded like the baby brother died, possibly at the hands of the neglectful mother. Question mark. It's very ambiguous.
I was wondering how that ties into the whole theme of motherhood, right? Because we have all these mothers in the story, and how do the bad mothers tie in?
The mother is. The mother in this case is, you kind of have to read between the lines that she's, the specific memory is that the baby brother is crying and he's hungry. And Cheese, whose real name is like Duncan or something, Cheese finds like half a stale cookie in the cupboard to give to his brother, who stops crying. Dustin. Thank you. Yeah. So he finds this cookie that he gives to his baby brother, who, and he smiles. The baby smiles and eats the cookie, a toddler, presumably. And then the mother, who has been lying down in the next room with quote unquote a headbanger, which I don't know if that meant like a headache or a drug-addled haze or what have you. The mother, comes to the toddler when he starts crying again because he's hungry. And that's like the end of it. And then the baby stops crying and that's it. That's the end of the memory. But we are informed that the baby brother has, had passed away. So you kind of have to figure that out on your own. That's sad. It's sad to think about, but gives us also kind of an idea of what his growing up was probably like. It was probably shitty, and then he joined the army, and he became a TV star, and now he's out on the street. Joyful.
I didn't actually snip that scene, but I remember it being pretty striking in the way that you described it there. Like it was something like, and then it was silent afterwards. I could probably pull it up. I've got my Kindle here. If I search for headbanger.
Yes, that's the term.
Ma is in the bedroom with one of her head beatings. That's why I couldn't find it. It's not bangings, it's beatings.
Head beatings. I misread it.
So beatings could be a headache from a hangover. It could be a withdrawal from drugs. It could be someone smacked her around. It's hard to tell. But I can read this if you want to include the snip. Ma is in her bedroom with one of her head beatings, and she's yelling to shut him up. I'm doing everything I can, making faces and trying to get him to laugh. He's not stopping. I tell him I'll take him out to the creek and look for animals, but he's not budging. He's shrieking so hard that I think he's going to bust himself. I hear Ma coming in her bathrobe with her head beating. She picks him up and embraces him so tightly I think she finally does love him. But then it's quiet. I've never heard it so quiet before, and I'm scared and I'm peeing myself. I can't hear anything. So I feel like that implies that she smothered him because he wouldn't stop crying.
Yeah.
Which is pretty brutal for, like, no wonder he has repressed this memory. And that's another snip I took of Dustin was he likes to forget he's Dustin Creed. Only cheese. Say cheese. Smile. So that implies that some memories should be forgotten, perhaps. And then Rosalind's unlocking them again and bringing them back up.
Yeah, that is a good catch. I was scanning my notes here, looking for that particular snippet, and I can't find it, but I'm finding so many things.
And under my notes for memory themes, I noted that Rosalind is unlocking memories via genetics, and the main character is unlocking memories via the manuscript translation. And I thought that might be an interesting juxtaposition as well.
Yeah, sort of this contrast between the material and the non-material, I guess. I don't know if you would refer to that as like the spiritual or the humanist, or that's one of those things that really depends on what you bring to the manuscript.
And just the way the book is structured just kind of mimics a flurry of disjointed memories. So it kind of leaves the reader almost as disoriented as the characters, I felt. So I felt like it was an effective way of presenting it, even though it's confusing as all hell.
Yeah. And coming back to the thing that we started talking about like 10 or 12 minutes ago now, I think, is that Rosalind's been using this drug on Cheese. He's recovered some memories. He unfortunately recovers a very traumatic memory from wartime, or in the stabilization zone, where one of his buddies was killed in action, and he and his team go out and they basically eke out revenge on a bunch of civilians and burn down their village, and murder people, whoever happens to be unfortunate enough to be there, women and children, whatever. He gets lost in this memory and burns down Aya's mother's house and all of the stuff inside, which kind of sucks.
Mm-hmm. And the descriptions that Aya has there of like, again, I should probably just pull it up and read it, but she's in the room grabbing as many treasured things as she can. And again, these are her mother's things. They're not necessarily even treasured for her. She just knew they were important to her mother. So she's just grabbing as many as she can, but she knows she can't grab them all. And she kind of takes one last look around the room, and all the things are like silently preparing for the end. And like that, I'm someone who tends to imbue sentience onto inanimate objects, and so that really spoke to me as well. I'm like, oh no, they're all gonna die, even though they're inanimate objects that are really just junk.
Yeah it's it was a pretty shocking scene. So the house burns down, and all the things are gone. And I think in a way that sort of brings our main character, to some kind of catharsis, because she finally, realizes that even though those things are gone, like, and the text is not trite like this. It doesn't sum it up like this. But she keeps going, and she comes to understand that, her memories, her memories are not altered, even though those things are gone. Right. And what's important are the connections, I think, that we have with each other. the stories that we share with each other, and not the physical things. Sal, the artist, makes this art installation out of the house and out of her parents' things that she's, all moved outside. Sal gets invited onto a TV talk show, another reality show, where they have her meet up with the mother and the toddler who survived the auto accident in which her parents were killed. And it's really unsatisfying, and the TV host is this really smarmy, person who's, saying, can you look at this mother and child and say that they should have died in the accident or whatever? And, of course she can't say that. I mean, it's ridiculous. And, she ends up holding the toddler, and it's really artificial, and it's really uncomfortable for everybody, and it's really awful. And it seems like, really the thing that makes Sal whole again. And then the way that she copes with the death of her parents is by opening this exhibition. Like that's like the personal sort of transformative thing that comes out of that for her. There's this whole plot about Sal's, former girlfriend coming back, and like they make up with each other, and, once the house is emptied of all her parents' things, Aya hears them having a conversation where they're talking about, how they could redecorate and how they could really make that into a space for the two of them, instead of a space that's full of other people's things. So that's how that goes. There is, it is eventually revealed during the text that one of Aya's childhood memories is making a romantic overture to Sal when they were teenagers. That it sounds like it was kind of rebuffed or not reciprocated, and that she maybe still felt hurt about that. There are these places in the text where it's mentioned that one of the other characters is sort of looking at her, seems to be like looking at her like on almost a molecular level, sort of noticing, taking in all of her. And it's very interesting because it gives you the impression that she's realizing that someone else is having a deep thought about her or drawing a conclusion about her, but she doesn't have any idea what it is. But as the reader, you can see, oh, someone's making a connection here, so I can kind of make a connection here too. So when Sal's ex-lover Judith is kind of, looking at Aya strangely, when Aya says, "Oh yeah, Sal and I painted these pictures together in the basement when we were kids," it's like, oh, okay, I see what was happening here. But
I actually want to go back to the TV show interview with Sal.
Yeah.
So, like, I just pulled it up in my Kindle again, because that whole scene is one of the ones I had to go back and reread because I was trying to piece together Sal's whole story. And this kind of fits into that whole motherhood theme again. And I'm still trying to, so this is probably one of the ones I was like, I hope Rose can explain this to me. Notes that I have in my Kindle. I have lots of those notes in here. But basically the whole interview is, it's between the person who survived the car accident that killed Sal's parents. And they're all talking about the choices that happened because Sal has been trying to sue the company, the cars that made the decision to kill her parents, basically. Mm-hmm. And so they have the woman and her child on the stage to show Sal the people that survived the accident. And isn't it wonderful that these people survived? Would you rather have these people be dead? Like, are you too happy to see them? And these kinds of things. Would you rather that this young woman, her child had died? Well, no. Would you rather have your parents alive? Well, yes. Mm-hmm, and mm-hmm. So the woman hands her child to Sal. And I'm just going to read this, I think, if I get to it. Angela hands the toddler over to Sal, and she doesn't know what else to do but accept the smiling thing, which tries to grab her nose. Isn't that love? Angela says. For a moment you think that Sal might actually slam the baby against the studio floor and reenact some slanted form of justice, but she only stares at the baby and murmurs a few words. Carol doesn't take Peaches back. She actually seems relieved to not have the toddler by her side. She's sweating profusely and pats her face with the sleeve of her shirt that's turning translucent. With the sleeve rolled up, you can see red splotches on her arm. The material is cheap and synthetic. Who does Peaches look like? Angela asks. Is she more like you or your fiancé? Neither. Oh, a man attacked me. The baby looks like that man. So that implies that the child here is actually the result of a rape, which is like adds a whole new wrinkle into this whole situation. That's a heavy subject to get into for this podcast, but like,
yeah,
the whole motherhood angle here, like this thing that you didn't want, but you've created it. What do you do now?
And I think another thing that comes to mind for me too is if that had been a data point, you know, in addition to the baby eczema, like baby was the product of a crime. You know, might that have been taken into consideration? Question mark.
And would that have changed the value of it? Like, so if this child is let's say belongs, that's not the right word, but if this child is with a mother that doesn't necessarily want it, who is that child going to turn into if they're not being properly parented? Like, are they going to end up becoming a vagrant because they didn't receive any love in their formative years? Like, whoa. Again, something that we probably shouldn't get into in this podcast, but there's like so many layers to everything. You can't just plug that into a computer and be like, beep, boop, there's the answer. Like, there is no answer here. There's too much to consider.
Yeah. 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 And the sort of the climax of the book comes when Aya gets her hands on a piece of video footage that she has been trying to get through her former professor, Socrates, for some time. And it's video footage that is mentioned in the manuscript that she's translating. And this is video footage of a young woman whose name was Yadra, I believe. Yadra.
Yadra, yeah.
Yadra. The snippet is from a television broadcast where there's a broadcaster, you know, standing like on the beach somewhere, you know, delivering a news story, and this young woman sort of wanders into frame in the background. And it's a very brief snippet. It's a very brief bit of this broadcast, but the young woman wanders into the background. The broadcaster sort of looks over the shoulder and sees her, and for a moment is sort of confused, like, oh, here's this, you know, this lovely young woman in these yellow robes. She's, you know, her hair is down and loose. She sort of, you know, looks up and smiles briefly, like a bird flies past her or something like that. She sees that the camera is focused on her. She turns back and points to the island behind her, presumably Sri Lanka, says something that the text of which I don't think, is it in there or not? I don't know. She says something and then she sets herself on fire. This is mentioned in the manuscript because the students see this on their televisions. They see this, and this is something that, I mean, it comes through the TV and it speaks to them very strongly, you know, and they learn.
Just as sort of an example of why this book is a brainworm, but was Yadra part of the soldiers from the manuscripts timeline, or is this present day in Aya's timeline?
No, she was, my understanding was that this is happening in the timeline of the manuscript. Okay. So this is a television broadcast that they see and that they mention. The thing that gets really confusing for me is that there's this whole digression into Yadra's background and how her home was disrupted by war. And you wrote about this really exhaustively in your notes, I saw, but like her whole family basically, you know, they try to make the best of it. But some soldiers abduct her older sister and they find her body at the bottom of a well. You know, her father has disappeared. Her mother and her younger brother, you know, try to make the best of it, but they eventually, you know, bad stuff happens to them. And Yadra is not going to just sit and wait for the inevitable to happen to her. She gets really angry and she joins a bunch of resistance fighters. And the thing that gets really confusing for me is that Aya mentions at the end of the manuscript, there's this list of 17 names, the same as the number of medical students. And these names include names that are mentioned in their manuscript as names of the students. And so I got really confused. Like, are we to understand then that these students were moved by the sight of Yadra, that they got involved as
my
resistance
understanding
fighters?
at the end was that the medical students all became resistance fighters, because the names aren't exactly the same, but some of them are actually nicknames that, like, I'm not from that culture, but I do know that, like, Preeti is a nickname for Parvati. So I think they are all the same. So it's the same 17 girls, and then they all ended up dying as rebel soldiers.
Yeah.
And that's, I was wondering, was I conflating the two lines, and were these soldiers that were in the present day, or like, is she like conflating like present day events in the stability zones with the things that she's translating? Or is it as simple as that's what happened then and this is what happened now? Like, I wasn't really sure if they were kind of bleeding into each other or not.
Yeah. And it was really, I think it was really confusing for me because that was the conclusion that it came to, was like maybe that they had been inspired to fight. But then there's more manuscript after that. And so it may just be that Aya was sort of translating things out of order. There's a funny story about one of their instructors. She's in her office, like screaming and crying, and they go in there and they find she's like cowering on top of her desk. There's a baby scorpion in her office. And the way they end up saving her from that is they take her lunch, her plastic container with her lunch in it, which is like fish curry or something that she probably was really precious and was really looking forward to having, in the midst of this like drought and famine and stuff. They trap the baby scorpion, the thing that she hates the most, in her Tupperware with the thing that she desires the most. It's just kind of a little bit comical in the midst of all this like terrible, devastating stuff. But I felt like when Aya sees that footage of Yadra, she has that moment, that same moment of catharsis that the medical students have. Like, they feel like, in those few moments she's on the television, she's coming through, she's speaking directly to them, she's inspiring them. What is the specific phrase that they use? The girl was giving us instructions, the remedy for forgetting. And this is where the line comes in order to truly awaken, you must break through the screen of this world. So she's literally like breaking through the screen of the TV. I mean, not literally, I suppose, but yeah. And this is in contrast to a line from the beginning of the book. Let me see if I can find it here. Oh, I know. Her mother, I think she here it is. The door is jammed, but still you can hear them. In the silence, your mother, the girls, whispering, and she's telling them, you, to listen, keep still, because she knows the secret to remembering. So we're contrasting at the beginning of the story the secret to remembering versus the remedy for forgetting.
Well, that really ties into that theme with Dust and Cheese of things that you want to forget, right?
Yeah.
Some things you want to remember, some things you want to forget.
Here's a weird highlight I made. It says, a man attacked me. The baby looks like that man. And my note was cool. I don't know what the context was for that, but there you go.
You're probably cool, as in ironically, like, oh, awesome, great. Another awesome thing from this book.
Yeah. There's a line in here about Rosalind's experimental treatment. This is Aya's thought. She says, it says, you read it a few times before you realize memory is being reshaped ever so slightly in your cousin's hands as she provides another narrative, like she's moving the furniture, polishing the mirrors, so sitting in one's pain on a quiet afternoon might be more tolerable. In another quote here, it felt like another one of your mother's homeopathic easy fixes, but years later, you're still trying to do it from the inside out, imagining yourself through the eyes of a stranger who is much more willing to tell a kinder story.
So you wanted to talk about AI, right? Did you have more to say about that, or did we kind of skim over all of it?
I think the thing that I wanted to come around to is that her job with this AI that she's training specifically during the events of this story, her purpose is to try and shape it like you would shape a child, right? Which is resonant with this theme of babies and producing and stuff like that. And so she's feeding data into Bogey. And at first it's responding to her. It's talking with her. It starts speaking Ukrainian at one point. It's like quoting Marx or something, which she finds really amusing. She has a conversation with it at one point during the story where, she's asking questions and it's answering her in ways that seem kind of superficially, at least, insightful. Ricky, her coworker, who she was sweet on, shows up later in the story. He returns, and they meet up and they have a meal together or something. And he gives her a shoebox with something in it. This thing that's in the shoebox is an old hard drive. This is ancient technology in the time where she is. He says, I want you to feed this into your AI that you're working on right now. He doesn't specifically tell her what's on it. It's just this old data of some kind. So she does, and it stops responding to her. It just goes silent after that.
See, I wasn't sure, did he feed it data that essentially killed it, like erased it? Because when she feeds it the data, she says, goodbye, Bogey. So did she know it was going to erase the AI or shut it down or delete its sentience, essentially? Because Bogey, the AI, was essentially responding to her in ways that she was not expecting. So it seemed like it was becoming sentient. And then Ricky gave her this data and it stopped responding. So did she know it was going to kill it, or did it just modify Bogey to be something that was not Bogey anymore? That's what I wasn't sure about.
Yeah, big question mark there. Let's we've been talking for quite a long time about this book. I think that I think we came to a lot of the same conclusions about it. I think we both enjoyed it. What did we learn? What did we learn from this book?
What did we learn from this book? I'm going to say that in every episode, probably.
Yeah, you have to smash the screen of the world.
I don't know what I learned from this book. I don't think I learned anything new from it.
Yeah. Maybe the learning that we did was the friends we made along the way. Does that work? I really enjoyed this book, and I think you did too. And I feel like probably we would both recommend it heartily. I mean, you have to be prepared to put yourself into it.
It does demand a lot of the reader, but when you want to invest yourself into this, I think it does need several reads to really catch everything, which is more effort than the average reader will want to invest. But I think that when you do invest yourself into it, and even depending how many times you read it, you're going to take something else away from it. But if it is in fact a capital A art, then that's the whole point of it, right? You're taking away something from it. You're imbuing yourself into it and learning something.
Yeah, absolutely.
Although I just said we didn't learn anything, but you're experiencing something. It's an experience.
You're learning about yourself. Yeah, exactly.
This book is an experience. It's not a knowledge imbuer. It's an experience imbuer.
For sure. I think I would like to read other books by this same author.
Yeah, for sure. This is her first actual book, because I kept seeing debut novel, but then I kept seeing that she's written something else, and I was like, wait a minute. But she's written some short stories before, which I might actually go look up, because this was interesting. And yeah, I'm
Yeah,
definitely.
immediately after I read this book, I went and I marked it on Goodreads, and I think I gave it 3 stars. And I went back a couple of days later and I bumped it up because I had been thinking about it that entire time. I kept thinking about it and thinking about it. And every time I thought about it, I had sort of I was making new and different connections. And like I said, I really wish I had time to, read the whole thing through again, because I think I would have gotten a lot more from it on a second or even third read. That's very, very cool. You had, I think, some similar books or other books that you wanted to talk about. You talked a little bit about House of Leaves and Life of Pi as like good ambiguity.
Yeah, I also think like House of Leaves was my first initial comparator, but I think Tale for the Time Being by Ruth Ozeki. Have you read that book?
I haven't, no.
A Tale for the Time Being. I read that for a different book club, and I really love that book too. It has a very similar feeling to it, and it has some similar themes, but it's much easier to read than this. It might not be quite as deep as this. It doesn't have the Inception layers of things going on and connecting to each other, but I feel like it had a lot of similar themes in terms of like, tyranny of the internet or whatever. And a lot of this book really reminded me of it. It had a similar feel to it. So that's definitely something I would recommend, like even over House of Leaves, in terms of someone looking for something similar to this book. But a book that you don't have to create a list of all the characters and do a Kindle search to like write everything down to figure out what's going on. Go read A Tale for the Time Being. And I also wrote down Night in the Woods as a comparator, as a, question mark comparator. That's not a book, it's a video game, but the main character in that, May, has a lot of similar introspective thoughts about grief and change and things. But by the end of the book, I was like, maybe that's not so much of a comparator, but then I didn't delete it. So now I've put it in here.
I think that's actually a really good connection that you made there, because Night in the Woods, again, also sort of, brings up, history, the grandfather. There's discussion of the grandfather passing away and the family history with the old records of the Union and stuff like that come up throughout that story. So it's maybe a little bit closer than you'd think. But yeah, that's a good one.
I think what I've learned from this book is that I don't know what happened to the missing fisherman.
What happened to the missing fisherman? Will we ever find out? Maybe there will be a sequel. Who knows? Meet us by the roaring sea.
Yadra disappeared by the sea because she set herself on fire, but like it seemed like she disappeared at the sea. The rebel camps were by the sea, and 73 fishermen went missing. There's some link there, but I need someone else's thesis to tell me what happened.
Yeah, and I don't have anything to add about the fisherman. I wasn't able to make that connection either.
We didn't even talk about Aunt Z and Uncle Roy. So was Uncle Roy... did he have a vow of silence? Uncle Roy doesn't talk. And I wasn't clear if it was an injury or mental illness or a vow of silence. It was implied that Aya's mother believed it was a vow of silence, but it wasn't explicitly stated whether that was what was going on.
Yeah, I took it as he fell ill in some way, and it might have been primarily a mental illness rather than a physical illness.
He was not mute. He could make sounds, but he didn't just talk. And then at some point, it was either Rosalind or the main character that said, maybe I should take a vow of silence. And I thought, oh, okay, so he did take a vow of silence. But then it was, that's like, it's referred to like maybe once. If I do a Kindle search, I might find 20 references to it, because that was my experience with this book. Was I'd be like, oh, this was never explained, and then I'd do a search for it and like, oh, it was actually really explicitly explained. I just didn't notice.
It could be,
just like her name being Aya. We're like, oh, she was never named, and then we searched and oh, Aya's right there.
There it is, right there on like page 2 or something. Yeah. The note that I made about Uncle Roy is that there's a part toward the beginning of the book where she mentions that, this is like Uncle Roy, staring at the toxic flowers. And I was like, toxic flowers? Like, what's going on with that? And I never did make any sense out of that either. So I don't know. You can follow us on Twitter or YouTube. Search for Robot Elf Book Club. You can write us an email if you feel moved. You can reach us at robotelfbookclub@gmail.com. If you'd like to read along with us, next month we'll be discussing LEECH by Hiron Ennes. I'll put a link in the show notes for you. Thank you so much for listening, and we'll see you next month. Bye-bye.